So as many of you know, we have been scheduling Food Truck Wednesdays, like a lot of churches around town. But you also may know that once again this week, we had a struggle that we did find out it was not their fault, thank goodness. But they weren't here that week. So of course, when we found out very shortly before everything was going to start, you can imagine the look on every member of the staff's face. I mean, it looked about the same. Whatever panic looks like on Jerry's face, that's what we had. Because that's what happens when you have a plan and the plan doesn't kind of work out. And so I said, what are we going to do? And of course, Gina was the first to respond. She called Domino's, which came through like heroes with 20 pizzas in 30 minutes. Jerry hopped in his car to go get those. Tommy offered to get drinks, and that list then included ice and a fruit tray and a veggie tray. Marion kept setting up, and then I prepared myself to greet people and let them know we were now having an outdoor pizza party on Wednesday. Sometimes ministry looks different than how you had planned, right? Our scripture today comes from Luke in the 10th chapter. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. I think Martha had a very different idea of this dinner and how it was turning out. Yes? Can I get an amen? We don't know if she had planned for more than a dozen people to show up for dinner, but even if she knew that they were coming, that's still a lot of work, right? But I trust that she had probably cooked her whole life. She probably knew how to, spread out a meal to feed a lot of people if she needed to, some tips and tricks. But we also know she had the added pressure of her friend and teacher, Jesus, was eating at her table. And she wanted it to be the best, right? There's not one of us who wouldn't want that to be the best. I learned this week, that's what happens when you research stories you think you know everything about. Apparently there was a famous cookbook that was going to have an image of Saint Martha slaying a dragon on its cover. Because apparently there's a legend in which she did that. And when I thought about it, as somebody who struggled to learn to cook, you can just ask my husband, serving a hot meal all at the same time and coordinated to a large group sometimes does feel like slaying a dragon, like you've accomplished something really big. But I think it's a reminder that what Martha was offering was important. She wanted it to be more than a nice dinner. She wanted to create something, a safe and comfortable space for fellowship. She knew how the table and being together can create that kind of fellowship. She knew the amount of important discussions and encounters that can happen when we fellowship. But something else can happen when you're working that hard and it doesn't feel like it's going to work the way that you had planned. Maybe she worried what they'd think of her cooking or how many dishes she offered, or they just wouldn't be impressed, or it wasn't what they wanted. Or maybe she was just tired and got cranky. We can just all offer her a little bit of grace, right? Because that's what Jesus does. Whenever I hear this story, I always hear him speaking with such tenderness to her, with such concern. Do not be mistaken, we were bummed on Wednesday. We also wanted to be the cool church with the food truck. We wanted to draw the big crowd that everybody notices. We wanted to be impressive too, right? But sometimes when we focus on that part, we miss what Jesus might call the better part. So we had to shift our perspective. We had to reorient about why we were there and what we were doing. And I think that's some of what Martha needed and got from Jesus, to see the bigger picture, to be reminded that she was already enough, doing enough, serving enough, that not only she was fine, but that she probably deeply influenced her sister to be brave enough to believe she could sit equally at the feet of Jesus. and learn like everybody else. She had already invited them in. She was already offering nourishment. She had created the very thing she wanted, the fellowship, and she almost missed it herself. She missed the fact that Jesus was already there. Jesus is not belittling her work in this story. He's just saying she might be missing the good things she had already created, that the fellowship was enough. As you heard in my offering fellowship is a fundamental quality of churches. As we know, churches around the country have traditionally always had fellowship halls. Can I get an amen from the former pastor? Yes, yes. We've all served pastors. Churches designate and name a place for this because the practice is so essential to church and community life. Now, they might have new names now. They might be called the gym or the multi-purpose room. But people don't typically build churches without a space for people to gather together. Because that's a reminder that church is still one of the last places where people of all ages still get together on a regular basis. Isn't that good news? That's good news. I remember during lockdown, I was on one of many Zoom calls, but with a mentor of mine, Raymond Williams, who is in his 80s, and he said one of the things he missed most about being in person at church is getting to see children, because all his children and grandchildren were grown, and what that meant for his week, things that we don't even notice sometimes. But intergenerational fellowship, we're one of the last places to offer this. And as a country, I think we still desperately need spaces like that for fellowship. I looked at statistics about loneliness this week in America. Statistics taken from the CDC, the NIH, and a project called The Roots of Loneliness. And they said 52% of Americans report feeling lonely, and 73% of millennials are lonely. They talk about in their studies how that impacts our health. The one good stat that came out of it was studies showed that loneliness and social isolation are less common among older adults who regularly attend church. This is not just one group needs or another group needs. We all need it. We all need social interactions. We all need to see a smile on the other side of the table. There is not a human on the planet that doesn't need connection and care, who want to feel that they are part of something bigger than themselves. We know that Jesus was welcomed in fellowship at lots of tables, some with people who agreed with him, some who didn't. But even at weddings, he didn't do ministry alone. He worshiped and he prayed with them. He served and he studied with them. But he also ate and drank with them and spent time together and told stories. And we are called and invited to do the same and invite others along with us. Jesus may have celebrated the one thing, the better thing is faith, but we know that it can be lived out in different ways. So what are some of those different ways? Well, that's part of this holistic faith series. We came up with this idea of well-rounded, it can be wholehearted, but holistic faith, that it has these different parts to it. Now, I came up with these 4 categories years and years ago when I was doing spiritual formation as a way of making sure we were kind of meeting all these needs in the programs and the activities that I was designing and leading. And the 4 things are fellowship, service, study, and worship and prayer. Now, these are very simple, but they're concrete ways to check in not only with our own faith lives, but also as a church about how we balance these things. But we know that there are some seasons in which certain parts are more prevalent than others. For example, we haven't been able to gather in person together for a couple of years, so fellowship has shot way up to the top of importance for that. It's one of the reasons we're talking about it first. But I also think that you start there. I used to think that you would start with worship. That used to be our first entry point, the most familiar place we would invite people into things. And I think that worship is essential and clearly incredibly important, but sometimes it can be the most intimidating way to discover Jesus. It's the most insider language. It's the most insider lingo and behavior. But fellowship, everybody needs, everybody wants, everybody can participate in. It's where the relationships can begin. Parents need places to bring their kids to play and be kids. Kids need adults beyond their parents to be interested in them and care about their lives. Adults have a huge variety of wisdom and knowledge, but also struggles and questions and concerns. Just the number of things I've gotten to learn going to these Wednesday night dinners, whether there's pizza or food truck there. I know who makes really good zucchini bread now. I've learned who makes amazing pies. I learned who can build things with their hands, almost anything. And somebody else who might know food truck connections, just from fellowship. And this week, anybody who sat with my daughter got the luck of eating the cookies she made at camp this week. And they were delicious. They were good. What seems like small acts have power and meaning in all those practices. Those ladies and men, when I was little, gave me fellowship, showed me what it looked like, lived and breathed it for me, and said, church is the place you will find that. Because Jesus tells us ourselves, where 2 or 3 are gathered, he's there. The better part is already present. And our story reminds us that Jesus does not call us to be perfect, but to be present with him and with each other. We are to bring our gifts just like Martha does that day. But it shouldn't stop us from participating in the fellowship ourselves. He wanted to invite her in and tell her this was her story as much as Mary's or anyone else who was present. There are parts of our faith we can do alone. Devotions, prayer, we can be with God in nature, we can study. But we are called to be community too. To be a place where we share all that we have, including our time, our wisdoms, our struggles, and ourselves. Fellowship is often where we can remember that each and every one of us can be Mary or Martha, but that we're all invited to sit and learn from Jesus. It's often in fellowship where we become a part of each other's lives, of those connections we talked about last week, that our freedom comes from the ways we are connected to each other. And when we get to know each other, when I share my embarrassing story, you share the thing you're struggling with this week. We laugh, or we cry, or we talk about the weather. In those moments, we become Jesus for each other. He becomes present in us and with us. We create, in those moments, a common story that connects all of us to each other and reminds us that we're all invited to this table. Every time. So I invite you to consider this week, how has the fellowship of this community shaped you? How has it fed you and invited you to see Jesus in another person? And how can you offer it with this loneliness that's living out here in the world? Where and how can you offer that fellowship? Where and when can you offer that grace and reminder that Jesus is still among us and with us? I was so proud of the staff on Wednesday. They remembered so quickly that it wasn't about being impressive, but of how we could be of service, how we could provide a meal and a place to be in fellowship together. They remembered so quickly that we had all that we needed. We had beautiful weather. We had a playground and a splash pad for kiddos. We had rock painting to beautify our space. We had plenty of tables and chairs, and we had all these people with a deep desire to be in fellowship. And every person who came, whether they stayed or moved on, responded positively to our desire to share what we had, even if it wasn't what we'd planned or expected. I believe out there on that night, we got to experience the better part. And both Martha and Mary's encounters with Jesus showed us how.